Could a technical error reveal the true state of a Formula One team? What happens when a most successful driver in history publicly exposes his engineer and crew chief? Today I'm going to tell you how Lewis Hamilton exposed Ferrari's internal fractures in the Singapore GP after experiencing one of the most dangerous moments of his career. It all began as the Singapore Grand Prix was reaching its final laps and the Marina Bay circuit was shining under the floodlights like a modern coliseum. The lights, the reflections on the asphalt, and the pressure of a tight finish made the moment dramatic, but nothing prepared the spectators, much less Ferrari, for what was about to happen. Lewis Hamilton, aboard his SF-25, had been making a silent but effective comeback. He was fighting for fifth position against Kimi Antonelli and had managed to close a gap from more than 4 seconds to just under 2. Everything indicated that he was in rhythm to overtake. But what came next was one of the scariest scenes we've seen in modern F1. On lap 59 of 62, Hamilton's car began to behave erratically. The car's sensors recorded an abrupt loss of pressure in the left front brake system. This was not a progressive decline. It was an almost total disconnection. From stopping at more than 4.5 G, it went to not exceeding 3 G. On a street circuit like Singapore, that means going straight into the wall with every stop, or, at best, losing vital seconds per lap. The sparks coming out of the car were not just visual, they were a mechanical cry for help. In just 2 laps, Hamilton went from controlling a comfortable lead of 30 seconds over Fernando Alonso to seeing in the mirrors how the Spaniard's Aston Martin was coming towards him. Each curve became a battle to survive, to not lose control, to not crash. There was no room for error. The cameras showed him struggling with the steering wheel, looking for areas of the circuit where he could rest the brakes without losing even more time. But it was useless. SF-25 was collapsing. In these conditions, the 44 seconds he lost in the last 2 laps are not simply a number. They are the representation of the total collapse of strategy, engineering, and trust within the Ferrari team. What should have been a solid, consolidating career ended up becoming a slow-motion horror movie. And even more serious, Hamilton had no prior warning. There were no signs of overheating during the previous laps. There were no alerts from the wall. Just silence, and then chaos. And that is when it is understood that this incident is not just a technical error, is a turning point, a before and after in Hamilton's relationship with Ferrari. Because this was not an isolated failure. It was the direct consequence of a technical decision made months ago and that many within the team knew could explode at any moment. Only it exploded with the greatest driver this sport has ever had, in one of the most demanding scenarios on the calendar. And while the car burned inside, figuratively speaking, the radio began to broadcast the real drama, panic, helplessness, and suppressed rage. But that is another story that will unfold in the next block. The root of this disaster was not sown in Singapore. In fact, he wasn't even born during the race. The origin of this failure, this mechanical betrayal, dates back to the first days of the preseason when the SF-25 had not yet traveled a single official meter. Ferrari knew it had a problem. He knew his braking system was not optimized, and he didn't correct it. Internal leaks after the Grand Prix revealed an uncomfortable truth. During initial testing at Fiorano, and then Sakir, some engineers noticed that the design of the brake cooling ducts was suspiciously narrow. In particular, the front brakes were showing a worrying pattern of overheating on long simulations and consecutive laps. This warning was reported directly to the aerodynamic design area, since the brakes are not only safety systems, but are deeply integrated into the airflow architecture of the car. This is where the story takes an even more disturbing turn. It was proposed to redesign the cooling ducts, but the response from technical management was a resounding no. The reason? Changing the ducts would have negatively affected the aerodynamic stability of the SF-25, especially on high-load circuits such as Suzuka, Marina Bay, or Monaco. In the desperate quest to reduce drag and increase straight-line efficiency, Ferrari had sacrificed a basic principle of any competitive car, reliability. And this was not a decision made lightly. It was a conscious technical bet, one that placed performance above the integrity of the car. According to leaked statements from Riccardo Adami, Hamilton's track engineer, the aerodynamics department imposed its criteria, convinced that the car needed every tenth possible to catch up with McLaren and Red Bull. The redesign was never authorized. The car debuted with that weakness built into its DNA. This highlights an even more dangerous internal fracture, the disconnection between departments within Ferrari. It was not a simple human error or a specific mechanical failure. It was the product of a structure that prioritized performance goals over the warnings of its own engineers. A structure where the departments do not listen to each other, where drivers, even world champions, receive compromised cars without knowing it. When you evaluate the magnitude of the decision, Hamilton's anger is understandable. Not only was critical information withheld from him, he was sent to compete with a car that was literally not prepared to sustain the race pace in conditions of high thermal demand. On an urban layout like Singapore, where natural ventilation is minimal and temperatures build up lap after lap, failure was not a remote possibility. It was inevitable. And the worst thing, it was not the first time that engineers detected this behavior. Already in the inaugural race in Australia, the SF-25 showed signs of thermal fatigue on long runs. In China, although temperatures were milder, the settings were adjusted to compensate for the brake's tendency to lose efficiency. What happened in Singapore, therefore, was not an accident. It was an announced chronicle. Therefore, when the international press began to talk about sabotage, it was not so much because of a deliberate intention to harm the pilot, but because of the conscious abandonment of the duty to protect him. It was strategic negligence. It was complicit silence. And all this silence, this omission, ended up exploding at the worst possible moment. Because not only did the brakes fail, the system failed. In Formula One, there is an invisible line between the driver and the wall. A line of trust, of technical synchrony, of mutual understanding. And that line is broken, not with screams or reproaches, but with silences that weigh more than words. That was exactly what happened between Lewis Hamilton and his engineer Riccardo Adami in the final laps of the Singapore Grand Prix. When SF-25 began to collapse, the first thing Hamilton did was turn to the only resource available, his radio. His voice, normally calm even in high-tension situations, sounded raspy. "I'm losing my brakes, mate." It was a direct statement without drama, but loaded with an urgency rarely heard from a driver who has raced more than 300 Grand Prix. Adami's response was almost automatic. A phrase any engineer would say in a moderate overheating situation, "Get up and slide to cool them down," is a standard technique. But that wasn't what was happening. It wasn't about heating up the pads less or stopping braking so violently. It was not a management issue. It was a functional loss of the braking system. Then came the phrase that changed everything. Without waiting for Adami to complete his next instruction, Hamilton interrupted with a mix of frustration and alarm. "I've lost my brakes. I've lost my left front." In that moment, something broke. Because that sentence was not just a technical report. It was an accusation. It was the revelation that Hamilton felt abandoned by the team, by the engineer, by the entire system that was supposed to protect him. But the damage was already done. Not just to the car, not just the pilot, but to the team. Because when a driver like Hamilton publicly exposes his organization, what he reveals is not just a technical failure. It reveals a lack of confidence. And without trust, no Formula One team can function. Much less one who aspires to be a champion. The word sabotage began to circulate strongly, but not in the classic sense. No one cut wires or physically sabotaged the car. The sabotage that was being talked about was more subtle, more structural. Decisions made from the comfort of the desk, far from the pit lane, which endangered those who did go out on the track. What happened at the Singapore GP with Lewis Hamilton cannot be treated as a simple technical episode. It wasn't just a mechanical failure in the final stretch of a race. What is really at stake is much higher. Ferrari's credibility is at stake. The competitive future of the team is at stake. And perhaps even more important, the permanence of Lewis Hamilton within the most emblematic team in Formula One is at stake. After what happened, a question remains in the air that no one within the paddock dares to answer directly. Can Ferrari offer Hamilton a project worthy of his legacy? Because the problem is no longer just that the SF-25 failed. The real conflict is that this failure was known in advance, and yet it was allowed to occur. When a team prioritizes aerodynamic figures over the safety of a 7-time world champion is not a simple internal lack of coordination. This is an unsaid statement. The car is more important than the driver. But the threat does not end there, because everything that happened in Singapore could have a domino effect. Vasseur's position is no longer as strong as it was at the start of the project. The figure of Adami, previously unquestionable, is now at the center of the hurricane. And deep down, the relationship between Hamilton and Ferrari is suspended in a delicate balance that could be broken with another similar episode. Is this the breaking point between Hamilton and Ferrari? Do you think that the team has the capacity and humility to transform itself from within to respond as it deserves? Or are we seeing the beginning of the end of an alliance that was born with promises of glory and today navigates between tension, mistrust, and frustration? Leave me your answers in the comments.